Okay, welcome to Psych 236, Developmental Psychology. Today we're going over chapter 22. We're talking about adulthood, the period of time that spans several decades, okay? And we're talking about psychosocial development. So some interesting stuff here, the more psychological stuff, okay? All right, just to remind you guys, hopefully you went over some of this in Psych 101, but Erikson's stages of adulthood. Erik Erikson proposed a theory of social and emotional development that spans the entire lifespan, okay? From birth, basically, until your ripe old age, okay? Until like right before death, okay? And these are Erikson's stages of adulthood. These are the last four. So identity versus role confusion, right? We talked about identity already. We talked about that during adolescence. Intimacy versus isolation, about finding a partner. We talked about that to some extent already, but we'll talk about it more here as it relates to adulthood. Generativity versus stagnation, right? Generating something of value or stagnating and going nowhere. That's a big part of this chapter, right? We're talking about adulthood here. These are supposed to be very productive years. And integrity versus despair, right? Which is something that comes up during the later stages of life, during late adulthood. Okay, but just to remind you, yes, last four stages of Erikson's stages of social and emotional development are these, and we will touch upon a couple of these. So let's talk about these theories of adult personality. Okay, we mentioned Erikson's theory already, at least part of it. Abraham Maslow, remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Proposed way back in 1954. He said we have 5 needs. Right? We have physiological needs, we have safety needs, belonging needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization. Okay, that last parentheses there shouldn't be there. But those are our 5 needs. Movement occurs when people have satisfied their needs at one level and are ready for the next step. So if you're satisfy your physiological needs, you can then be concerned about your safety needs. If your safety needs are met, then you can care more about your belonging needs, being with other people, for instance, right? Forming relationships, getting married, forming a family. If that is met and that, that has been satisfied, then you can care about your esteem needs, right? The need for achievement, right? To acquire things that make you feel good about yourself, that degree, achievement, right? Getting that promotion, that kind of stuff. And then self-actualization, which is the highest need of all, but the least necessary one, which is when you achieve your full potential. That's what Maslow said, right? Later in his career, Maslow reassessed his final level, the self-actualization. He suggested that there's also another level beyond this, and he called it self-transcendence, which is not attained until late in life, right? Self-transcendence, right? When you live in this different reality and you kind of transcend the passive animal state, right? Where you're living in a higher reality. That's just to remind you of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we're not going to say much about that last stage, but you already know about those first 5 that he proposed in his hierarchy of needs. Remember the pyramid, right? And his hierarchy of needs. There they are: physiological, safety, belonging, esteem needs, and self-actualization needs. More about personality. Another theory of personality, which is a very simple one, says that your personality can be defined by 5 basic traits, 5 personality dimensions, 5 traits, right? So it's called the Big 5 theory of personality. And if you put the traits in a certain order and you take the first letter of each one, it spells ocean. O for openness. To what extent are you open? Okay. Openness has to do with basically, being open to new ideas, trying out different things, right? As opposed to being set in your ways. People who are more open are more likely, for instance, to, try different kinds of food, more likely to travel and see different cultures, not just, Europe and the US, not just the so-called Western culture, right? But also other countries as well, like India and Africa and Latin America, right? They're more open to new ideas, more likely to be accepting of, let's say, gay marriage, for instance. But if you're the opposite, if you're at the other extreme, that means you're more closed. You want things a certain way and you don't like things to change very much. Conscientiousness, another personality dimension of the Big 5. Conscientiousness has to do with the extent to which you're willing to work hard, right? To be punctual, to follow the rules, that kind of stuff. Conscientious people tend to be very hard workers, very good workers, productive. According to research, it's the most important personality characteristic for success. If you want to be successful, it's a good idea to be conscientious, to follow the rules, to work hard, to be punctual, that kind of stuff. People who are not conscientious are the ones who don't care, and they'll do whatever they want. They won't show up on time. They won't do their work. They won't follow the rules, and they'll basically fall behind in life. They won't amount to much for the most part, unless they're already born privileged and rich, okay? Extroversion, another personality dimension, right? People who are extroverted are basically fun-loving. They like to be with others. They're sociable. They're talkative, right? They have lots of friends, that kind of stuff. At the other extreme, we have people that are introverted and don't like parties very much, prefer just to have a few close friends rather than a lot of them, are not as talkative. They're more shy, right? More introverted. And then we have agreeableness. Agreeableness has to do with, well, just like it sounds, right? People who are nice, who are caring, who get along with others. At the other extreme, we have people who are disagreeable, people who are mean and argue a lot and fight with people and don't get along with people. Of course, there are degrees. You can be somewhere in the middle. You can be, you know, between agreeableness and disagreeableness. I mean, most of us would be somewhere in the middle. Yeah, we're somewhat nice, but we're not that nice. Some people are very mean. Some people are extremely nice. Same thing with extroversion. You can be somewhere in the middle. Same thing with conscientiousness, somewhere in the middle, right? Or openness, you're somewhere in the middle. You're like a moderate, okay? And then there's neuroticism, the last one. Neuroticism has to do with emotional stability. The more neurotic you are, the less emotionally stable you are. If you are neurotic, it means you worry a lot. You get anxious very easily. You get fearful very easily. You get angry very easily. You get depressed very easily. You're not emotionally stable. At the other extreme, we'd have people who are very emotionally stable, who don't really worry that much. They don't get angry that much. They don't get anxious. You know, if they fail an exam, they don't worry so much about it. They say, it's all right, I'll do better next time, things like that, right? Of course, most of us are somewhere in the middle. We worry a little bit, but not a whole lot. Some people worry a lot. They're very neurotic. And some people don't worry much at all. They're very emotionally stable. According to the authors of the Big Five, which are Costa and McCrae, they said that these five personality traits describe the whole of your personality. This describes who you are, right? These 5 dimensions. And they have a test, right, that you can take, and it'll tell you how you rate on each of these dimensions. You know, if you disagree with them, that you don't think this simple theory describes all of personality, then I challenge you to think about something, a way to describe someone that isn't already covered in this theory already. So you might think, well, what about someone who's funny? That would be extroverted. What about someone who cheats, right? That would be someone who's very disagreeable. Okay. What about someone who's stupid? If they say something like that, right? Well, that one's a little bit weird. Where would that fall? Or someone who acts dumb, right? You know, yeah, that's one that's more of an ability thing, right? No, it doesn't have to do with being this. Okay, so yeah, maybe it is possible to think of some, right? Someone who's smart, where would that fall? Oh, you know what? No, I got it. It does fit into this theory. Someone who's really smart is usually also very conscientious. They work hard, right? They study, right? They're intelligent. So someone who's not very intelligent or who's dumb, if you believe in such a thing, right? That would be the opposite of conscientious, okay? That people who don't work very hard, who don't know what they're doing, don't follow the rules, right? So you can see we can kind of make an argument for just about everything, every way to describe people. We kind of try to fit it into one of these 5 dimensions. Thought I kind of caught myself there, and I thought of something that wasn't related, but it actually does fit into the theory. Let's keep going. Okay, so let's talk about one of Erikson's stages of social and emotional development. Let's talk about intimacy. Intimacy versus isolation. That is connecting with other people, developing relationships. This is adulthood, right? Which spans from about 25, like 40 years, okay? Like 40 years, from about 25 to like 60, 65, okay? A very important part of adulthood is finding a romantic partner, getting married, okay? Settling down. Worldwide, there's a postponement of marriage, right? People are taking longer and longer to get married. okay? It used to be that people used to get married like right after high school, right after age 18, right at age 18, right? When they graduated high school. And that still happens, by the way, in many countries and in many parts of the US. There are still people like that. In some countries, they get married even younger. There's people who get married when they're children, or they're forced into marriages, or they have arranged marriages, right? But for the most part, people are getting married later now. They're putting it off, okay? Society benefits when most adults marry and they stay married. There is a benefit to society when people are married, okay? People get married, they have kids, they raise a family, and then if they're together, they can usually do a better job of raising the kids. Also, when they're married, they buy homes, right? And they buy things for that home and they spend money. It's good for the economy, right? They send their kids to school. It's very good for society for people to be married. It's not as good when people are single, okay? Even though they can still spend a lot of money, but usually when people are single, they are not as stable, okay? And they can also misbehave more, okay? As opposed to being more responsible and more productive, okay? A satisfying marriage improves health, right? It makes you feel better emotionally, physically, right? When you're married, when you have somebody who loves you and that you love back. It also makes you more wealthy when you combine those incomes, especially if you have two incomes, right? You will be wealthier. If you get divorced or if you're single, you have less money. Because if you share your wealth, right, you're both better off, usually, okay? And usually people are happier when they're married. And all these things help to improve society, okay? Marital happiness levels are changing due to cohort, income, education, and culture. Yes, it is changing, right? People are waiting longer to get married. Income is different. It's harder for people to make ends meet, okay? Education, culture, all those things will impact marital happiness. And we'll talk about those things and problems that can be caused by, you know, some of those issues, right? When things differ. Percent of US adults who are married, right? Who married, okay? So those born before 1940, most of them married, you know, close to 100%. That's probably like 95% of them got married. There's a small percentage of people who decide not to get married. Those born between 1940 and 1960, about 90% of them, around there, got married. About 10% of them decided not to. Those born between 1970 and 1980, right, were below 79% of those people got married. That's my group, okay? You guys, even less of you are gonna get married. Why? Because people are choosing not to get married. They say it's not worth it, not worth the trouble, not worth the hassle, not worth the headache. Less and less people are deciding to get married. That doesn't mean they won't have kids, by the way, and that they're not gonna have someone. They'll still have someone. A lot of them will still have kids. But a lot of people choose not to get married nowadays. A lot of people stay single, or they're together and they don't get married. And that percentage, the percentage of people who get married, who marry, is decreasing over time. You know, I wonder what it is now, right? For people now that are currently, you know, in their 20s. Actually, we won't know until later because some people get married later. Not everyone gets married in their 20s. Now they get married in their 30s or even in their 40s. So it's not until decades from now we'll know how the current group in their 20s is doing, okay? So the people behind me, so to speak, the younger generation, you know, growing up after me, after my group, so to speak. The people basically maybe born in the 2000s, okay? How many of them are gonna get married? Or born in the 90s or in the 2000s? We'll know later, okay? But I can guarantee you less of them are getting married. We can see the trend, it's very clear. What about those that are gay and lesbian, okay? Communication is essential for a happy partnership, for any happy partnership, any happy marriage, okay? Faithfulness and supportness leads to emotional well-being, which increases over time, right? Being faithful to one another, supporting each other is very important, okay, to you feeling well about yourself. Problems in gay and lesbian marriages, or people who are gay and lesbian may not necessarily get married. It is the law of the country now. You can get married if you're gay, if you're lesbian, but some people still don't, right? And the problems they face are similar to those found in heterosexual couples. They also argue about money. They also argue about children, if they should adopt. You know, they don't always have children, right? But they can adopt in a lot of states. In some states they can't, but they also argue about those things. They also have disagreements about lots of things. They have some of the same problems. Family acceptance and influence may cause conflict. It's harder for them when their families don't accept them being together because they're against gays or lesbians. or they think that's unacceptable, or they're against gay marriage, or whatever it is. That can cause more problems. And though most people do accept, gay marriage now and do accept gay people in general, there's still a big chunk of the country that does not. It's probably in the 40s or maybe in the 30s now, right? Last research I read about gay marriage, about 50-something% of Americans accept that. It's probably higher now, it's probably in the 60s, but there's still a group of people, at least a third, that will probably never accept it. And it's usually because of religious reasons, okay? They're very strict about their religion and stuff like that. Sometimes it's not religion, sometimes they're just prejudiced, okay? But, if there isn't acceptance of that and you have a gay couple, they will have more problems, okay, when their families do not accept it. Let's talk about divorce. It's very common among adults. A lot of people get divorced. But divorce isn't always bad, okay? Divorce that ends in abusive, destructive relationship, right, usually benefits at least one spouse and the children. So if that's about 1/3 of US divorces, when people get divorced, about 1/3 of the time, that actually ended a very bad situation, right? That is actually better. It's better that they're divorced. It's better that they're separate because it was a very awful relationship that involved a lot of abuse and just horrible things, and the children were suffering. And sometimes divorce is a good thing. Most of the time, 2/3 of the time, about 67% of the time, divorce is not a good thing and hurts the children and hurts people. But sometimes it's a good thing. If you have someone who's beating you, abusing you, or just that you just hate each other's guts and you can't stand each other, and you're always fighting in front of the kids and you just don't get along, you're probably better off divorced, okay? But divorce also has, negative consequences. Even if psychologically, it's a good thing, it can be negative consequences. Divorce usually reduces income. So rather than having two incomes, let's say if you were both working, now there's only one, okay? Or even if, let's say there was one income and now you're divorced, usually that person who actually makes money has to give some money to the other person who doesn't have a job, or to raise the kids, especially if it's the mother. So the income has to be shared now and separated. And either way, you wind up with less money, whether you both have your incomes or it's only one partner, one person, right? You end up with less money. Divorce is a very, very quick way to become poor, okay? Because you think about what you have when you're together, right? You usually have close to having twice as much. Then you get divorced and now you only have about half. That's what happens. It depends on which person has custody of the kids. They'll usually get more money, and the person who doesn't have custody of the kids, they'll have to pay. But a lot of things now are kind of, they're trying to be a bit more fair now, and they give, often give equal custody now to parents, where he gets them, let's say 3 days out of the week, maybe she gets them 4, or they share, and it's close to 50-50, which means that the income is also more equally split. But either way, it is split and you end up with less money, okay? I can imagine my situation, right? What I have, right, when I'm together with my wife, we could afford a nice house. We could, we have a decent lifestyle. If I were to get divorced, I know she would get the kids for the most part. I mean, maybe I get partial custody, but I know that, both her and me, we'd both be a lot worse off economically. Especially me, probably, because she would get the kids, and probably get the house, and I'd have to go find another place to live. And sure, I mean, it depends on the percentage of custody and stuff like that, how much money I'd have to fork over to her. I make a little bit more money than her, not a whole lot more. But either way, we're both going to be worse off economically. That's the way that's what happens when you divide income, okay, that you shared, okay? Confiding in children may help the adult, but not the children. Often you tell the kids about the problems and you share with them, and it makes you feel better, but then again, you're stressing out your kids. You're telling them about how bad that person was and about how you don't get along. It doesn't necessarily help the children, but it's a thing that a lot of people have to deal with. About close to half the marriages end in divorce. But part of those divorces are actually a good thing for people and a good thing for the children. Most of them are not. Family bonds. Let's talk about family bonds. Okay, so family links and influence endure over time, right? So here's the thing, the relationships that you had as a kid, right, with your siblings, your mother, your father, these links endure over time. Childhood history impacts people across their lifespan, right? The way you got along when you were kids, right? whether this was favoritism and things like that, that affects your relationships down the road as well. People tend to argue about some of the same things. My wife was still arguing, with her sisters and with her mother about how she was treated differently, or about how her sister basically, did a lot of bad things to them, or just took things that didn't belong to her, that belonged to the family, because and then even when her mother died, one of her sisters took like all the stuff, all the mementos and all the pictures and stuff like that, and all these things, right? The same problems that you had early on as a kid, right, when you were growing up, tends to affect you down the road as well. Sometimes people never even forgive each other. Providing companionship, support, and affection meets intimacy needs for parents and adult children, right? Yes, having close relationships, getting along, right, having that support, it's actually beneficial, and it helps people, even when they become parents themselves, right, to have that support. Rates of boomerang children are increasing. Okay, let me explain that, okay? Boomerang children, that's when you have kids, they grow up and they leave the house and then they come back. Those are boomerang children. So it's like a boomerang, right? You throw the boomerang and then it comes back to you, right? Well, the children, you raise them, they leave, and then they come back. And they can come back for many reasons, often for financial reasons, right? They cannot yet afford a house of their own. They went to college, now they're out of college, and they haven't gotten a job yet, or they do get a job, but they can't afford a house. Think about how expensive things are, especially in California. It's getting so bad in California nowadays that even professionals cannot afford a house here, right? Nowadays, with me and my wife, we're both educated, right? We both did better economically than our parents as far as the amount of money that we make. We both have much more education. But as far as we can afford, what we can afford, right? We can afford something that's only a little bit better than what they were able to afford. And we're lucky that basically for us, it was like more than 10 years ago that we bought a house. The people growing up now and are graduating from college now, right? And they're having to buy a house now, they're finding that what they can afford even as professionals with the incomes of people with bachelor's degrees, that what they can afford is they can afford basically your starter home, so to speak. They can afford the houses that the poor people lived in for the most part. I know that. I grew up that way. I grew up poor. I grew up in East LA, right? Where those homes used to cost like $80,000, $100,000. Now we have people, graduating from college, Latinos and stuff like that, and find out that they can't even afford a house in East LA because even there, they're $500,000, 600, 700,000. Think about that, right? So what do? They go back home. They live with their parents. Or sometimes they get divorced and they end up back home. And it's getting harder economically. And that's why nowadays, you might raise your kids and, and they might come back to you and just end up living in your home. And hopefully that they're just hoping that they're going to inherit the house later on. And maybe then they'll sell it and maybe they will have some income so they can buy their own home. Now, if you're a relatively wealthier family, right, live in a better neighborhood, then it's different. And you can help out your kids with, like I said before, with because your home is worth like $700,000, $800,000, $900,000, $1 million. You got it for almost nothing. Like 40 years ago, you got it for like $100,000, right? And you live in a good neighborhood, so it's appreciated a lot. And so you can help your children a lot more. And that's what people often do. Those who can afford it, help out their children and help them buy a home of their own. I'm hoping to do that for my children, by the way, right? Me and my wife have been very careful with our income, saving, paying off the house quicker, all those things, so that we can afford to help our children, because we know how difficult it's getting, especially in California. And by the way, that's the reason why a lot of people are leaving California. They can't afford it here anymore. The poor people are leaving. They're leaving to other states, right? They're leaving to New Mexico, where they can buy a home for $150,000. Vegas, by the way, no longer affordable. Vegas is expensive now. So there's a whole bunch of other states where you can go and live for a lot less. But some of those people that live in those states often don't want Californians, right? They say that they're ruining their state, driving up prices, changing the way the state's both politically, right? Yeah, that's what happens, right? When other people move in, but that's part of life, right? That's what happens. People go where they can afford to live. More about family bonds. Family closeness can sometimes be destructive, right? Some adults wisely keep their distance from their blood relative, right? There are many cases where people grow up and become responsible, but they come from very dysfunctional families and they don't want to get caught up in their problems anymore. My family, for the most part, is okay. Once we all grew up, we were dysfunctional, But once we all grew up and we all made our own lives, now we're okay. But I have other families, relatives and stuff like that, cousins who've gone on to college and graduated and now have their own lives. Their lives are okay, but their family is still a mess because some of the people in their family got caught up with drugs or caught up in other things. So they're still living at home and they're 40 something years old and still driving their mother crazy, still drinking or just doing drugs there and just causing a problem for the family, even though they're grown up children. They're in and out of jail and things like that. And some of them wisely keep their distance, say, you know what, forget this, right? You come visit me, I'm not going to come visit you, right? Because they don't want to get caught up in that. There's some awful things, right? Sometimes that people have to avoid, where the family is still dysfunctional. People still hate each other, still don't get along. There's still a lot of abuse and problems, right? And I know plenty of examples like that. Fictive kin, this is someone who is accepted as part of a family to which there's no blood relation. Adults need kin, fictive or otherwise. It's like fiction, right? Kin are those people who are related to you, that you're bonded with. Fictive kin are those people who you accept into your family, who are not necessarily related to you biologically. Okay, so it's good to accept other people into your family. Maybe somebody's spouse or whatever it is, or adults when they get older and their children leave the home, right? And they might feel lonely. They'll have friends as well, neighbors, and sometimes those people can feel like family to them, especially when their children are no longer around, right? Because they've grown up and living their own lives. And it's good to have these relations. Some people can become, some friends, some neighbors can become like a part of the family, really close. And you especially need those as you get older. Let's talk about work in general, right? Generativity, one of Erikson's stages, generativity versus stagnation. Hope I'm not going too slow here. Generativity versus stagnation. Okay, so yes, according to Erikson, during this period of time, right, that spans like 40 years, we're supposed to be working, being productive, raising a family. The work of adulthood, okay? We're going to talk about that. Generating something of value, generativity. Erikson, okay? So after intimacy versus isolation comes generativity versus stagnation. When adults seek to be productive in a caring way, right? Be productive. Maybe at your job, raising a family, there's different ways to be productive. Adults satisfy their need to be generative in many ways, including being creative, right? Maybe through music, to art, some of them through caregiving, through raising children, others through, a big chunk of them through employment, through just having a job. Most Americans work. Actually, yeah, most of them do work. I'll put it to you this way. Most people who are of working age, most people in this period of adulthood work. There's about a third of people who do not work. Maybe because they're stay-at-home moms or they're unemployed or something like that, but most people work, okay? I'm not saying a third of people are unemployed. Some people are just, there's a bunch of housewives too, okay? Big chunk, big percentage. I'm not saying that most women don't work, but there is a percentage of them that don't work, who have husbands who make enough money and they stay home and raise the kids. There's still a lot of that. But most people do work, and this is the way they satisfy this need, according to Erikson, this stage, generative versus stagnation, that they actually work, okay? Feel that you're generating something of value, being productive. The impact of parenting on parents. So generativity's chief manifestation is establishing and guiding the next generation. Part of generativity versus stagnation, generating something of value, is raising children, right? You're doing something good for society, hopefully by raising good children. Every parent is tested and transformed by the dynamic experience of raising children. Raising children is very, very hard. You're going to be tested. You're going to be transformed. It will change you as a person to raise children. Usually for the better, okay? But it is just so hard, right? When you first become a parent, and then by the time you're done, you're a much different person. You've had to go through many different experiences that you wouldn't have had if you were not a parent. So it will change you, okay? It will test you. It is really hard. If you think being a parent is easy, you're probably not doing it right, okay? It's just hard, okay? Just when an adult thinks he or she has mastered the art of parenting, the child advances to the next stage, and the adult is required to make major adjustments. So it's very hard, especially hard at the beginning when they're newborns, right? You have to feed them constantly and change them and hold them and take care of them constantly, keep an eye on them every minute. right? And then they get a little bit older and they can play a little bit more on their own, and it's a little bit different. And just when you think it's gotten easier, all of a sudden they become teenagers and they drive you crazy again. Okay. And then they get older and more responsible, and hopefully they grow up and make lives for themselves, and and then it gets easier. So there's ups and downs when it comes to raising children. And then of course, if you have a special needs kid like myself, right, then it's going to be hard all the time. Caring for biological children. So some caregiving involves meeting another person's physical needs, right? Feeding them, cleaning them, right? But also involves meeting a person's psychological needs. You have to be concerned about them psychologically as well. Parenting is very stressful, especially when the parent's most urgent need is intimacy. It's very stressful, okay? Here's the thing, very stressful for people. You have kids, okay? And at the beginning, you just have to feed them and clean them and change them and do everything for them. But you also have a need for intimacy. You have a need to be with your partner, right? And be intimate with them and have your relationship, right? But when you have kids, it's very hard. You kind of have to put those needs aside for most of the day and then go to bed. And just when you think your kids have gone to bed and you can have some time for each other, they wake up and start crying and you get all frustrated, and it happens a lot. And yes, it will ruin your life, your love life, okay? Having kids, especially when they're little, ruin your sex life, okay? Not everybody's, but it just makes life so much more difficult. It really does. And often you don't have much time for each other. Or when you do have time, you're very tired because you're working, you're raising kids. And then people also get upset because they feel like the other person doesn't care for them anymore. Sometimes people change. For me and my wife, since we have kids, it seems to me like I don't matter anymore. Like she doesn't care about me anymore. She says she still does, but she's very mean too. It's very hard to raise kids. And sometimes it just doesn't feel like the other person cares for you. But that's the reality of raising kids and trying to have your intimate moments with your partner. And it's not just about sex, by the way. It's also for caring for one another. Sometimes all you do is argue about the damn kids, right? And all you do is work, and you don't have any time to relax. Especially if you're a mother, by the way. Women have it harder. And the husband's complaining, like, why don't you give me any attention? Why? Because she doesn't have much time, right? And because it's hard, she's frustrated. Sometimes she thinks that you're not helping her out enough. And sure, she doesn't want to give you much attention when you don't help her out that much. There's got to be give and take. Parenting reorders adult perspective is an ongoing challenge, right? It reorders your priorities. When you have kids, no longer is your priority your husband or your wife. They're not the priority more. Now it's the kids. It's a challenge, and it's just an ongoing challenge. It changes your life, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. Having children in general is the most difficult thing you're going to do in your life, but also the most rewarding thing. It will change your life both for the better and for the worse. Okay, it goes both ways. Although fathers' involvement in care has increased, the gender division of this labor remains. Yes, like I said, most women still do most of the work. And because of often that, there's a lot of anger and frustration and resentment, right? And he looks very selfish because he still wants his needs met in the bedroom, but he's not helping out much raising the kids. And so there can be a lot of problems because of that. You are going to have a lot of problems when you raise kids. It is very hard. And you're going to have disagreements about a lot of things. Even if you both help out, you're going to disagree about a lot of things, about what to feed them, about what they should wear and where you should go, all kinds of things. I have a lot of disagreements with my wife about what the kids eat. I think they eat too much junk food. I think they should be healthier, right? But, she disagrees, okay? Adoption, okay? There are some people who meet this need by adopting. They don't have kids of their own, but they adopt. So when you adopt children, you're legally connected. When you have your own children, you're legally connected to them, right? For life. When you adopt kids, it's the same thing. They're your kids, right? You adopt them. When you adopt children, the biological parents are usually absent. Often, most of the time, they're not involved in their kids, in their biological kids' lives, right? But they wanted to be involved, but they just couldn't. It's a sad story for most parents who gave up their kids for adoption. It usually doesn't mean that they don't care for them, don't love them, but they had to give them up because they couldn't afford to raise them, or they weren't, ready. they were too young. They didn't have jobs or whatever it was, for whatever reason. Most of them wanted to keep their kids, but they couldn't. Or sometimes they died, or they're disabled or whatever it is. So they had to give them up. Okay. Strong bonds can develop between those children that are adopted and their adopted parents, especially when the children are adopted as infants. Like I said before, if you adopt them when they're young, when they're early, when it's early, right, it's easier to form that bond, that very strong bond that you have, with your own biological children, right? And it's not always as you expect. You see there the picture, right? That woman adopted those two kids right there. Those are two African-American children being raised by a white mother. There is a lot of that happens. A lot of kids don't end up with parents that are the same religion or same ethnicity as they are, because there's often more people who are poor and who are minority in need of adoption than there are people who can adopt them. You have to meet certain income requirements, certain requirements to be able to adopt kids. And sometimes it just happens that it's there's a greater percentage of white people in this country. More people are white, and a greater percentage of them also are just meet the requirements for being able to adopt children. Not just anybody can adopt children. You have to meet certain requirements, income requirements, stability requirements, home requirements, and things like that. And yes, it often happens that, yes, children will end up being raised by somebody who is ethnically different or with a different religion. It happens a lot. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. More about adoption. During adolescence, these bonds may stretch and loosen as some adoptive children become intensely rebellious. I mentioned this before, right? About adoptive families, that when the children get older, they become teenagers and identity becomes important. Often they are not as willing to accept you now as their mom and dad, as their parent, because all of a sudden their identity is important. And like, you're not my mom, you're not my dad, you can't tell me what to do. And they can become more rebellious. There's something known as reactive attachment disorder, a real disorder in the DSM-5, where children, adoptive children especially, are unable to form a secure attachment to their caregivers. They have trouble managing their emotions, problems forming meaningful connections with others. Yes, like I said before, it's harder if, for instance, when the children are older, it's harder to form a secure connection with them. Or if the child has been abused or neglected, they are not so trusting. And it can be harder for you as an adoptive parent to be able to bond with them. And they often will not accept you because you're not the real parent and they know it. Or even if they're infants, there's some infants who have had some real, trouble in their life, some very traumatic experiences. And it can be harder for them to bond with the new parents given what has happened to them, right? Because remember what Erickson said, right? That first stage, right? Trust versus mistrust, right? If things go well for you early on, you develop that trusting, loving relationship. If they don't, you become more distrustful. And if you are adopted, it's harder for you to form that bond with the new parent. Racial socialization, like I said, that can be an issue as well. Sometimes, white parents adopt Black children, or that happens more often than the other way. It's a lot more rare for Black parents to adopt white children, but it happens more often that white parents will adopt Black children because there's more Black children in need of adoption than there are white children in need of adoption. And there's more white parents in general, okay? 2/3 of the population in this country is white. There's more of them, and they often meet the income requirements more so than other parents. So because of that, they may receive different socialization, right? They may be raised to think and believe one way when their reality is actually very different. It's a very different thing if you're Black and raised by a Black family than if you're raised by a white family and in the white world, so to speak. But you being Black, even if you're raised in the white world, you are still different. And you'll learn that as you get older, right? You may not realize it early on, but it matters, okay? Let's keep going. What about step parents? What about when people get divorced and then they bring children into another marriage, okay? Step parents. So the average age of new stepchildren is 9 years. 9 years. People get divorced and then they get remarried and they have children from a previous marriage. And usually these children are about 9 years on average. Some of them are younger, some of them are older, but on average it's about 9 years of age. Disruption may occur with changes in living arrangements, right? You live in a different home, or a new person comes into the home, and you become part of a new family, right? That is very disruptive to children. The effects are cumulative. In other words, they build up over time. Young stepchildren often get hurt, sick, lost, or become disruptive. And teenage stepchildren may get pregnant, drunk, or arrested. It's harder to have, to raise stepchildren. They often don't accept you as a parent. Okay, and they are treated differently, even when you don't intend it. When you don't intend it, they will often get treated differently. They're more likely to be neglected, more likely to be hurt, get sick, lost, right? Get lost and be disruptive. But often they don't accept the other people, so they're more likely to want to run away. Okay, but get hurt and sick, and they're more likely to be ignored. It's hard as a step parent. Biologically, you're inclined to favor your own over somebody else's child, right? But also the children also may not accept you. So there's a double effect there. What about foster parents? It's estimated that more than 400 children in the US are officially in foster care, being raised by somebody other than their parents, right? Most of them are in foster care for less than 1 year, okay? And often they might have another foster parent after that. The average age of, for these foster kids is around 7 years of age when they first go into foster care. And many are still attached to their biological family. They want their real parents. They want to be with their real family, so to speak, okay? It's the most difficult form of parenting, to raise foster kids, okay? It includes expenditures, of course, economic things, but also psychological things, okay? So they exhaust your psychological and financial resources. So here's the thing. So yes, it's expensive to raise children in general, right? And you do get help from the government for raising other children that are not your own. But trust me, it is not nearly enough, right? What you spend on children compared to what the government would give you. You should not become a foster parent to get more money, okay? You are not going to get enough to raise them. And if it is enough, or if you're just pocketing the money and not taking care of them, you're hurting the children. But usually it requires a lot more than what you get in return from the government. But it's the most difficult form of parenting. They're less likely to accept you. A lot of them come from, homes where they've been neglected, they've been abused, or there's been drug problems. For whatever reason, the parents gave them up, or they couldn't raise them, and now you have to try to raise them as a foster parent. It's going to be very, very hard. Most foster children have experienced maltreatment, like I said, witnessed violence, are suspicious of any adult, suspicious of other people. They're not very trusting, so it can be very difficult as a foster parent. What about being a grandparent? Grandparenting presents a new opportunity for generativity. When you become a grandparent, right, you can still help out. You can still help generate something of value by helping raise the kids, right? On average, people become grandparents at about age 50. For me, it's not going to happen much later, right? Because I started like 10 years late, right? It's related to family needs, grandparenting, right? Whether you can, you're going to be a grandparent or not, whether you're going to be very involved or not depends on how much they need you. Some grandparents are needed a lot, sometimes not so much. About 5% of them provide total care. About 5% of grandparents are actually raising basically children that are not their own. They're raising their children's children because their children couldn't do it for some reason. Okay, about 5% of them. Grandparenting can also provide 2-generation care in skip generation families. Okay, that often happens when basically the parents die or for whatever reason, so the grandparents step in to raise them. Okay, grandparenting can also provide kinship care. About 1/3 of foster children. Here's the good news about foster care. When children are put into foster care, many times they're not put with strangers. Many times they're put with an aunt, an uncle, or a grandparent. About 1/3 of the time, it's the grandparents who get the children when their own parents couldn't raise them. Okay, but it can be another way for them to help out or be involved. Caregiving is a lifelong process. Raising children is a lifelong process. Even when they're grown up, you're usually still involved in some way. Okay, Caregiving includes responding to the emotions of the people who need a confidant, right? Someone to hear them out, shoulder to cry on, right? A cheerleader, right? Something you have to cheer them on. You have to counsel them, provide advice, a close friend, right? Parenting is all of those things. And they don't just need you when they're young, they will also need you when they're older. Just not as much as when they were younger, but it's a lifelong thing. A kin keeper is the caregiver who takes responsibility for maintaining communication, gathers family for holidays, conveys important family news, and fosters generativity in their other family members. A kin keeper, think of it this way, okay? And a kin keeper is the person, once the children grow up, right? The kin keeper is the one that sends out the invitations for the holidays or for the birthdays and things like that, and tries to get the people together, like for Thanksgiving or for Christmas or for some other holiday. That's the kin keeper. It's usually the women who do that. Sometimes it's the men, but mostly it's the women. Those are the people who are kin keepers, right? Those are the ones that help get everybody together. And maybe some other family, it may be, they may not have a kin keeper. They might not have somebody who does that. Like in my own extended family or my own family, it's not me who does that. It's usually, my mother, okay? Or it could be somebody else. It could be an aunt or an uncle that decides to get the family together. It's usually not me, usually not my wife either, but we have other people who kind of help get us together. And the person who is in charge of keeping the family together, especially as the family grows with children and grandchildren, that person is called the kin keeper. Some people feel squeezed during adulthood. They feel squeezed. So because they feel squeezed, they're often called the sandwich generation. It's like they're caught in the middle. The sandwich generation is the generation of middle-aged people who are supposedly squeezed by the needs of the younger children and older members of their family. So in other words, they're raising their own kids and they're also helping their grandparents. They're raising their own kids and they're helping their own parents. It usually happens because their own parents are older and frail and are in need of help. So they're helping their own parents who are elderly and frail, need to be taken care of. And they're also raising their own kids at the same time. So they're caught in the middle, they're squeezed. But in reality, some adults do feel pressured by these obligations, but most are not burdened by them. Most of them, even though they are helping their own parents and raising their own kids, right? Most of them don't feel like it's that bad. They don't feel that burden, either because they enjoy helping people, they enjoy fulfilling these requirements, right? Or because they choose to take on only some of them or none of them. There are some that decide to, for instance, just, raise their own children and let somebody else take care of their parents, because there's usually more than one sibling. Most people are not caught in the middle, is what I'm saying. Most people don't feel that they're caught in the middle or being squeezed, but there are some people, yes, whom that happens to, who they're the ones who ends up raising their own kids, because that's what most people do, but they also end up helping their own parents as they get older and they need more help. And those people can feel very burdened or very stressed out. But most people don't have that situation. We'll talk about at later adulthood, who that's more likely to fall on, who is more likely to help out their aging parents, okay? I'll give you a clue, it's not males usually, okay? But sometimes it is, okay? But most of the time it's females, and I'll tell you more about that later. More about employment, let's talk about employment now. Employment, right, is the other major avenue for generativity. Employment is the other way in which most people feel they're generating something of value, right? So generativity versus stagnation, generating something of value, two things according to Erikson: raising children, and the other thing is having a job, doing something productive in that way. Adults have many psychological needs that employment can fill. Your employment can do a lot of things for you. It can give you a sense of identity. It can give you higher self-esteem, more income, make you feel like you're valued, right? Employment is associated with higher rates of unemployment. When you are unemployed, when you don't have that, that's associated with higher rates of child abuse. When people are unemployed, they're mad, they're frustrated, they're more likely to take it on their kids, more likely to use alcohol when they're unemployed, to deal with stress, deal with the anxiety, right? More likely to be depressed and have other social problems. People who are employed, right, feel better about themselves usually. And especially if they have a good job where they feel that it meets that it meets their needs as far as identity, where they feel appreciated, they feel valued, right? All that makes people feel good. And when they don't have that, it can cause a lot of problems. So work meets generativity needs by allowing people to do many things. Work allows people to develop and use their personal skills, right? To express their creative energy, allows people to aid and advise coworkers, allows people to help others, to mentor people, mentor a friend or a colleague, right? Allows them to support the education and health of their families because they have a job, they make money, they can help, right? Provide for their families, right? For their education and take care of their families. Often having a job, especially a good job, means you have a healthcare plan and that you can provide for the health needs of your family. A lot of people have part-time jobs that may not provide that, okay? And yes, I do believe that everyone should have healthcare and it should be free, okay? It shouldn't be something we should be arguing about. Healthcare is a very important thing. We should all have it regardless of whether we're employed or unemployed, whether we're rich or poor. And work can also contribute to the community by providing goods and services. When you have a job, you can produce things for the community, whether you're a baker or you're a construction worker or a fireman or whatever it is, you're doing something for the community. And because you're making money, you also get to buy things from your community and you help each other out in that way. Work is very important in maintaining a community. There are extrinsic rewards of work and there's intrinsic rewards of work. The extrinsic rewards of work involve the tangible benefits, the things you can kind of touch, right, so to speak, right? The outside things, right? Usually in the form of compensation. So people get a salary, they get money, they get health insurance, they get a pension, right? Those are the extrinsic rewards of work, right? We're talking about the outside things, right? But work also provides intrinsic rewards, right? Intangible things, things you can't really touch, you can't really put your hands on, like job satisfaction, make you feel good about yourself, self-esteem, pride, a sense of identity. It can help with all those things. Those come also with having a job, especially if you have a good job that you enjoy. I will tell you though that most adults in the US, their job is usually just a way to make money, a way to have a salary. Most Americans do not like their jobs. About 60% of them don't like their jobs. So a lot of them do not get this sort of intrinsic rewards when it comes to work. For them, it's just the extrinsic stuff. They're doing it for the money because they have to, but they don't really enjoy their job. It doesn't give them satisfaction. It doesn't give them a sense of self-esteem. Come on, flipping burgers or working at, maybe UPS delivering packages. That might not be enough, right, to help out your self-esteem or for you to feel pride or a sense of identity. For most people, their job is just that. It's a job. For some people, it's their career. It's their calling, right? But most Americans don't have, fulfilling jobs. About 40% of them do. And those people do get both the extrinsic and intrinsic rewards of work. For me, it's, I have both, right? I think I have a good job that really speaks to who I am and I enjoy my job. And I also get decent pay and health benefits. Wages and benefits, let's talk more about this. So absolute income matters less for job satisfaction than comparison to comparable professions or jobs. So how much money you make, it matters, but what matters more is how much money you're making compared to what other people who have similar jobs are making. So you can feel that even though you make a decent salary, you can feel like you're being cheated, being shortchanged, you're not making enough money if other people who have the same kind of job as you are making a lot more money. Okay, or if you're making more than others that have the same job, then you do feel like you're better paid. So it's not just how much money you make, but how much money you make in comparison to others. And in the US here, well, we have some very high standards when it comes to comparisons. Okay, this is a country where a lot of people have good jobs, a lot of people make a lot of money, and a lot of people feel cheated. A lot of people feel that they're not being paid enough because they cannot afford those things those other people can, and they just don't make enough compared to those other people. Yes, in this country, you can make a lot of money, or you can have a job that you make so-so. You can make very little money. And even people who have decent jobs can feel like they're not making enough because they're just not getting paid what they should compared to other people who have that same job, that same kind of job. I'll give you an example with like lawyers, for instance. You think lawyers make good money, right? Most of them don't. Most of them make average salaries. But you hear about the ones that work for the big law firm or are partners who make hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars. Most lawyers are not like that. Most of them, a lot of lawyers will feel that they're underpaid, even though if we just think about it in an absolute sense, we might think they make good money, but a lot of them would consider themselves to be underpaid because they just have regular jobs, you know, where they work for a county or maybe the county or the government or a law firm or something. And they're not a big shot at that law firm. They just have a job and they get paid just a decent wage, but not like the people we hear about. Unemployment is actually very destructive. If you don't have a job, right, you're not making any income, it's very destructive. Even if you are getting income in the form of, you know, unemployment benefits and things like that, being unemployed is actually very destructive of physical and mental health. Being unemployed, not having a job, reduces your self-esteem. It makes you feel awful when you lose your job, when you don't have a job, you feel awful. There's people who are basically depressed and miserable, people who end their lives because they're unemployed, because they lose their jobs. That's how important it is. Okay, I'm not saying it happens to most people, but yes, usually when you're unemployed, you don't feel very good about yourself. You feel awful. Emerging adults may create a lifelong impact on a generation. Okay, remember, we talked about this before when we talked about domestic violence, right? NEET stands for not in education, employment, or training. If you're not going to school, you don't have a job, right? Or you're not getting some kind of training, you're not doing any of those things, you feel awful usually. You're very frustrated and angry, and you're more likely to take it out on your spouse or your kids, more likely to, you know, engage in domestic violence and more likely to beat your kids and things like that because you're very frustrated. You're not in education, not in employment, not in training. You're not doing any of these things and you feel awful, right? If you don't have a job, you should at least be working toward getting a job, maybe getting an education or getting some training. If you have none of that, then you feel very frustrated, very awful. Many Americans are concerned about the income gap between rich and poor. Yeah, I mean, it just seems like in our country, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And wages are not rising fast enough. Things are getting more expensive, but wages are not rising fast enough. And we know that because it's getting harder to afford the basic things in life, to afford to be able to feed your family, to afford to be able to pay the bills, to afford just to have a mortgage or to pay the rent. It's getting harder. We used to be able to do this as Americans, by the way, not my generation, but people who were older, used to be able to do this with one income. Back in the 50s, the 70s, one income is all it took. Usually the husband had a job and he had a decent job, and that was enough to afford a house and have a car and go on vacations. By the way, let me qualify that a little bit and say that that was mostly for white people. It wasn't the case for black people so much, or for Latinos or other people. Okay, that was mostly the white reality. But even for white people, it's gotten harder. It's hard to make it on one income now. Now you need two incomes. And even with two incomes, it's often not enough. It has just gotten harder. And that's the reality. And it's gonna get worse. Okay? Some people are trying to do things to, lower the gap and things like that. But there's a lot of politics behind it, a lot of fighting. We're a very divided country. People with money and power usually get their way. The poor usually do not. Your best hope for a good future, by the way, an education. Get an education, right? Do well, get at least a BA, if not higher, and then you have a shot at a decent life. That's your best shot, unless you were already born rich and privileged, okay? That's the reality that we have nowadays. All right, that is where we'll stop.